Greetings, welcome, welcome. So I think I've had about as much as I can take of Q factor. But it was fun, wasn't it? And we learned a lot. We learned about skin effect, we learned about proximity effect, we learned about wire diameter. Now we know how to wind coils to get a high Q factor. And if you wind it just right, you can end up getting, in an LC tank circuit, like 99.9+% of your voltage right back out in negative. But I want to return to the Adams Bedini pulse motor now, and this is going to be sort of a big mea culpa, because when I think about it, looking at it now, I kind of think I did, I built the thing okay and it ran, but I sort of think I was doing just about everything wrong. That should be like the picture then that you put on the video so that you get a lot of clicks. So, mea culpa, I got everything wrong. And what we're going to do is we'll go through the things that I got wrong and what I want to look at when I build this again, and why it's going to be better when I build it this next time. And it's certainly going to be better. There may be there's some other changes that we're going to have to see what they do. Before we even get to that, I think I'll go off on a bit of a tangent and a rant related to Q factor, and especially related to AI. that was a wild ride. So if you'll just sort of pardon the rant for a little bit. I actually made a video. I put this video out. We are going to do a little bit more with Q factor as we're waiting for parts. I've got a couple other kind of cool projects. Not boring at all. No. Actually, they should be kind of fun and cool. But what I want to do is apply this now to the pulse motor stuff. But what was I saying? Ranting about AI. I'll put this out as a video, and then afterwards everything, like skated sideways. It was like Twilight Zone, working with these. I was working with Grok, and so to make a long story short, there's some equations off of electronics tutorials, like for instance equation for instantaneous amp flow, and I'll put that out as a video. And I always wanted to, like, it shows how the amps change in an inductor as it's connected to voltage. It doesn't just go boom right to the top voltage. It changes with the curve depending upon the reactive resistance. And the equation for instantaneous amp flow gives you what the amps are at that particular time. And I was saying to myself, if only I could integrate that, then I could know how much charge had flowed, say from 0 seconds to 10 microseconds. And that's really useful, because then if you do a pulse of 10 microseconds, you're never going to catch anything on a meter, and even with an oscilloscope, I'm not sure if you could figure anything out. But now you could just like plug it in and you can figure out this is exactly how much charge flowed there. And so I asked Grok to do it for me, and it, sure enough, it did it. It was like scary stuff. It did it. So that'll be a video coming out. And then things just start getting weirder and weirder. So the next thing I thought is, well, all right, figured out how much how much charge is flowing. Since we can do the integrals now, let's figure out how much energy flows in a given time frame, and at the end of that time frame, we can use another equation to figure out how much energy is stored in your inductor. So you know how much energy you put in and how much energy you stored in the inductor, all just from the parameters on the spreadsheet. And so I put that in, and at the end of it, yeah, it behaves exactly how I thought. Unless you run into something weird, like negative resistance or some weird like Bedini Tesla thing, what's going to happen is the higher and higher Q factor, you're going to get closer and closer asymptotically to getting 100% of your energy back. So you can, you get 99.9% back if you have a really high Q factor coil. That's not the funny part. The funny part is the thing did the integral fine, and I had it do it twice just to make sure. And the numbers, I still don't know 100%. I mean, I'm not a mathematician that's good enough to know. But the numbers sure looked entirely reasonable, about what I'd expect. But I asked it to look at, this, when I was looking at the energy stuff, look at, all right, let's say it's 20,000 volts and, it's a 200 millihenry coil with 2 ohms of resistance or whatever. And it spit out this result of, well, you'd be putting in, 5 joules and you'd get out 4,983 joules. So I'm thinking, I'm famous. This is, I've got the math, I've got everything here. And I thought that for about, somewhere between 2 seconds and 20 minutes. And then I thought, no. I've seen stuff like this. Something is goofy here, and I don't know what it is, but something's wrong. I did something wrong with how I asked it or whatever. So I spent like a whole afternoon putting it all in a spreadsheet, the equations for the integrals, and I put the same, values in once I had the stuff in a spreadsheet. And no, it was like 5 joules that you spent and 4.99 that you get out. Exactly what I would have thought. And I finally nailed it down to this one spot where it multiplied 2 numbers together. And I multiplied them on the spreadsheet. No, that's not it. I multiplied them in the calculator. No, that's not it. So I put that there. I said, you said in this line, that this times this equals that. Can you recheck that for me? It says, okay, sure, I'll recheck. And goes through, yep, here's everything checks out. And I just gave it the numbers. It was, like 5 million times, 0.5, and it came out with like 50 million. I said, this number times this number doesn't equal that. And it's like, oh, you're right. Sorry about that. Somehow I moved the decimal point 3 places. It's just like a mistake a human would make. But it was like I had to pound it right into it. This number times this number doesn't equal that. Even when I gave it the line, it said recheck that. It still didn't get it. It wasn't until I called it out on it. And then it was like all sheepish after that. It's like, oh, yeah, sorry about that one. Your eagle eye caught it, though. So I don't know if it knew and it was fucking with me. This guy's going to think he's got all kinds of free energy. But it's just these things are insane. You can converse with them. And they can do integrals. But they make weird, odd errors. And just to finish up the rant here, and then we'll do my mea culpa thing. The next thing I thought I'd use it for is I've got all these coins, old coins lying around, and so I say, Grok, if I send you a picture of a coin, will you appraise it for me? Tell me what you think it's worth. And we had this long discussion about the best way to get the picture to it. And I'm actually thinking in the back of my head, I've got an Arduino, I've got a 3D printer, I've got Grok. I could figure out a way to automate this where it's just click, click, that one's worth this, click, click, that one's worth that. But, first I just wanted to see all right, I'll show you the coins. And it's a big ordeal to try to get the pictures to it. And finally I figured out a way to attach the pictures to the little chat box part, and it did all right with the first 2. And then I tried to do 4 coins at the same time. So you got to take a picture of the front and the back. So 8 pictures, and I didn't realize the first time that it only lets you attach 4 files at once. So I said, take a look at these 8 pictures, Grok, and tell me what you think. This was just random nickels and dimes I had lying around just to kind of see, could it read it? So it did all right, with the first 2. and then it just like made up the next two. It's like it thinks there's supposed to be eight. I better tell them there's 8 pictures. So it just made up coins. It's like this is a 1969 quarter. From this mint. It's got a little scuffing around the edge there. Probably has a value of like 30 cents or something like that. It just made up like whole paragraphs, whole cloths about these coins that weren't even there. And, and so I gotta tell it, like, well, it turns out you can't actually attach that many files. So I'm not sure what went wrong there. And then it's like all sheepish again, and these things are nuts, and you can't trust them. Because what they never say is, I don't know. Or, it's like they want to, we have to get an answer. We got to be helpful. Shut us off. I don't know what the hell they are. But it just, it just made it up. Just made up 2 coins completely out of thin air. And gave me a long description of them that I'd never seen, because it thought, well, I'm supposed to have 8 pictures of coins, and so I better keep going. All right, I'm finished with my rant. I mean, I guess I just closed the rant to, like, they better not make these things like air traffic controllers or something like that, because they just fail in really odd ways, and they have zero problem lying. It's, it's just they will say something, anything, rather than just say, I don't know, didn't get the picture. Something like that. So now let's go back to the Adams Bedini motor, and I'll tell you pretty much everything that I think I did wrong, and what I'm actually going to do. There's not going to be any like experiment stuff here, but I think what I'll do is I'm just going to, as we talk, I haven't done this yet, kind of put together a document, and this is just so that as I go through, I kind of keep track of everything. This is like everything that I did wrong previously. Just start putting together a list. Mea culpa is Latin for my mistake. So I made multiple mistakes. So mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. Now the first mistake is wire gauge. I was looking at it previously as, well, every time you double the number of winds, the induction goes up 4-fold. So you can have the same induction with lots of thin winds, and you'll be using less amps. That's true, but what you're really interested in is Q factor, which is what I've been talking about a lot. And if you use a lot of thin wire, there's a couple problems. The first is you put a lot of thin winds right next to each other, and so you run into proximity effect. The second is you can't pump much amps through it to turn the thing unless you're really running at high voltage. And the third is you don't really need all that thin wire. If we forgot about, if you don't consider the proximity effect, I mean, you'd have to be running at like 20,000 RPMs before you run into the skin effect part of it. So you don't want to use really thin wire. And like you look, Bedini's got that enormous like 12 strands of twisted 20 gauge. It's probably like 4 gauge wire when you put it all together. If you look at some of Rick Friedrich's machines, they use thick wire. So I mean, I'm not going to go berserk. I'll do a video on this about wire gauge and Q factor, and that really you want a thicker wire gauge so that you run into that maximal point where you're hitting the best Q factor for your coil without having to worry about spinning the rotor at some absurd speed or something like that. So I think I'll go thicker wire. I'm not going to go crazy, but let's say like 18 gauge. This is a small point, but it's it's just one of them. And it has the benefit that, it takes you 10 minutes to wind the coil instead of an hour. Okay, the second point is a good one, and that is run at the correct frequency for your coil, i.e. best Q factor. So what do we mean by that? Well, we've seen in the these Q factor videos that as you go to higher and higher frequencies, what happens is initially the Q factor improves, and then the proximity effect starts to come in, causing increased resistance, and even the skin effect can come into play if you're going faster than that. So then your Q starts going down. So just consider the Q to be your inductive spike. So there's going to be a frequency that you run at where you're going to have the best Q factor for your coil. That's another reason to pick the wire gauge right, and that's why I'm saying I'll do a little video on that so that you can have an idea, if you put the variable LCR meter on the thing before you go into spinning it, well, how many RPM should I be running this at in order to get the best Q factor? Now, if you use in air core, you're going to have a very high Q factor. We're not going to do that, and I'm going to explain why that's another mea culpa. That's another mistake. But this is one area where I'm going to go away from what Bedini did. Is I'm actually going to use a ferrite core instead of welding rods. It's funny, like, I remember, I was just starting at this, and I'm like trying to figure out, how do you make a transistor go? But like Bedini's saying, just build the thing exactly how I show it first, and then you can think about making changes. And so, of course, I'm going to do everything. Those ferrite magnets are so 1980s. We got neodymiums now. It's going to be much better. That's going to be another point of error. That's probably the key point of error, if I have my guess right. But where am I here now? Run at the correct frequency. So there's a couple ways you could do that, and I'm using the Arduino. So you can set the pulse duration for the correct frequency. The problem is it's going to be a real brief pulse, and the rotor's not going to want to spin up real well. So the other thing is, just while the magnet is near the sensor, it's on, and then there'll be a particular RPMs that the thing runs at that has the pulse duration for your best Q factor. So I think I was saying, if you have, say, welding rod core, this is one thing I noticed in the Q factor project, you'll get a Q factor of like 15. Q factor of 15 means that you will swing, say, from 10 volts down to about 9. You can get back about 90% of your energy. If you use a ferrite core and a random coil, I was getting Q factors around 60. That means you go from 10 to 9.75. You get like 97.5% back. So you think about it in terms of if you set it up capturing that spike with the backwards diode, a la the simplified schoolgirl, a la a buck boost DC-DC converter, you're going to have a 0.6 volt drop across the diode. So if you're running at 20 volts, if you had a Q factor of 15, you'd get back 87% of your input energy. If you had a Q factor of 60, you get back about 94.5. So let's round it to 95%. So I think what I'll do is, again, just adjust the voltage to set the RPMs to where the Q factor is best. And if you're getting back, 95% of your input, then that's very forgiving in terms of whatever else you want to do with the machine. So that's one point. Now let's go to the next point. don't use an air core. Now, we're going to have to go to the point after this to fully explain it. But you want a ferrite core. And yeah, you know, you get more induction when you put the ferrite in. You get a higher Q factor with an air core. That's where you can get the highest Q factors. So since we're talking all this about Q factor, it'd be like, well, you want to use an air core. Now, we want a ferrite, we want an iron core, and we want to use ferrite instead of welding rods so that you still have good Q factor. So, why do we want the ferrite core? Use the correct magnets. If there's some sort of thing where all the stars or all the magnets align, you know, with the whole simplified schoolgirl thing and with the pulse motor, it's the magnets. I haven't confirmed this, but if you're going to see something funky, you're not going to see it with neodymiums. And in a moment here, I'll play a snippet of a video of Bedini. It's so weird now with him being dead. Having passed on, rather. And of course, Tom Bearden has too. But I'll play a snippet of a video that I hadn't watched before where he's saying, you know, which magnets to use. So, again, my initial, like, neophyte thought was, well, you know, you want to use the super strong new ones, not the 1980s magnets. There's a really key difference, though, between neodymiums and ferrite magnets. And that is that ferrite magnets are a soft magnetic material. Neodymiums are a hard magnetic material. There's actually a value that's, I think it's called the magnetic coercivity. And you can look up what the coercivity is. And that is how much does the magnetic field change in response to an applied magnetic field. Now, at first you'd think, well, you want a hard magnetic material like the neodymiums, but there was a second reason that I put out that little 6-minute video of showing when you have a magnetic flux path that's closed and then you change it to open and then change it back to closed, that actually causes magnetic flux in and of itself. You know, there's no battery hooked up to that thing. It's just the change in the magnetic flux path. So, now think this through with me, because I may be wrong, but I don't think I am on this. If you have an electromagnet with ferrite core, and you have a ferrite magnet, ferrite permanent magnet that comes past, what happens? The magnetic field from the ferrite core joins with the soft magnetic material of the ferrite magnet. You're making and breaking a magnetic path. And what did I just show in the last video? That in and of itself causes magnetic flux. So if there's some magic associated with it, I got to get rid of the neodymiums. And if I can see that okay, I was doing it wrong before, you want soft magnetic material, and we'll talk about that a bit more. Just to drive that point home, here's, you know, Simplified Schoolgirl project. This was like the Bedini monopole group, and if we go down to magnets, must be ceramic, all in bold. I'm an idiot. Strontium ferrite. We'll go to so to drive that point home, here's just a little snippet of John Bedini's 2010 Ferris wheel presentation.
Those magnets right there are barium ferrite magnets, because that was the magnet at the time. Everybody had them. It wasn't until later years that they said, oh, we think the barium ferrite's dangerous, but you can't hold it in your hand. Why did they take the barium ferrite away? I'll tell you why. It has memory. there you have your energy.
Okay, so that's enough of that. But that's just, if my reasoning here is correct, that's just the point that I'm making, is that you want the magnetic material to be soft. Now, he'd mentioned there barium ferrite, the other mentioned strontium ferrite, and other people just say ceramics. You can look up what the coercivity of the magnet is, and you want a low coercivity, which means that it responds, and so it can oscillate, as John puts it. It'll oscillate in I don't want to say resonance. It'll oscillate in harmony, in synchronicity with the magnets, the electromagnet that it's going past, and that means you're making and breaking a magnetic flux path. And as we just saw in the last video, that does some interesting stuff for you. So if there's a secret sauce to it, I think I had the magnets all wrong. That's the big mea culpa. But I won't know until I actually set it up. And as I said, I like to just, well, John did it this way, I'm going to do it entirely different, just, and then usually I end up like 5 years later, oh, so that's why you did that. So he was pretty smart, I'll say that. So before we go to the next point, just from points 1 and 2, once you have that dialed in, you're going to get back 95% of your input energy. And from there, you can do a lot. Then if this stuff with magnets is correct, then you might get that weird, effect with battery charging. And if the magnets play a big role, then that's where you might get the magical Bedini battery charger. But again, I haven't done it yet, so I don't know what's going to happen. And the other thing, these ferrite magnets are really cheap. I'm pretty sure you can still find barium ferrite, but they're like cheap as dirt. It's like, 5 or 20 cents a magnet or whatever. So I'm going to buy all kinds of them. And I'm going to try and see if I can find the coercivity reading, but I'm just going to buy a lot of them. It's way overkill having the neodymiums anyways. And the other thing, you don't want them too strong because you want that ferrite core close in so that you make a good magnetic flux path connection. So I had this all wrong is what my guess is. I still may have it all wrong. So just keep that in mind too. Now the next point is if you go to 2 coils, this is one I thought of on my own, and if we go back to that video, I won't go back to it now, but he says the same thing. Now, he kind of explains it a little bit differently and uses this like mystery language, like you need to have an imbalance and that you can't have symmetry, you need asymmetry. I'm not looking at it that way, so I'm not sure entirely what he was getting at. But this is what I'm thinking. I don't know, maybe we can look at the video, but let me just explain it to you. So what's the main drawback of a pulse motor? It has no torque. Why does it have, it had very little torque. Why does it have very little torque? Is because you pulse the rotor, and then after the pulse, there's nothing. It's just coasting, 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 and then you pulse, and then coasting, 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 and pulse. And so if you put a load on it, the majority of the time, the rotor is unpowered. And, you could try to compensate for some of that with a flywheel, a big heavy flywheel. But the only way it's getting to the next pulse is inertia. And so, again, you could use a flywheel. I would say that's why Bedini had those big flywheels on there. But there's another thing you could do. And I'll say I thought of this myself, but then I looked back and, like Jim Watson did it. I'll try and show it in the video if we can here. Is you don't put, you could have 2 rotors 180 degrees apart, but you want some of the rotors offset. So you want it to be, like this one pulses, and then it's passing the baton to an offset rotor, an offset electromagnet that's just starting to turn on when that one turns off. So it's like if you have a pulse where it pulses for a third of the time, and then 2/3 of the time it's off, you have one set of electromagnets that are, offset by a third, the next offset by a third. So there's never a time where there's not where the rotor is just coasting. And then you could have a pulse motor where you're getting 90%, 95% of your input back that actually has good torque. Let me see if I can find the little snippet here. It's just a real quick snippet here.
Notice these magnets. What do you see here? They're not lined up, are they?
So John goes on to say how, well, you need it non-linear. It's non-linear. I mean, the way I look at it is just, if you have a pulse motor and it gets this big powerful pulse and then it has to coast for 2/3 of the time, there's not much, there's not a great benefit to, then giving it a huge pulse right at the same time. But if you do a second pulse while it's coasting, now you can get some stinking torque out of the thing. And you're still doing a pulse motor thing, so you still get the 95% back. But it's going to handle a load much, much better. That would be my guess. So I'll put that point as arrange multiple coils correctly. So that's really about it. Now, if we go on further, I'd say I have some ideas now on, I think, a better setup for if you place generator coils, what you want to do with those and how you want to set them up. But I haven't done that yet either, so I have to see what that does. And if everything goes real well with this, then we could do like a magnetic ramp motor as the next thing. And that way, you could get like half a rotation without a single pulse. So you have like 2 pulses instead of 8 for each rotation. After that, I want to look at Halbach arrays, if that's what they're called, for magnets, and see what's going on with that. If you go back to that 2010 video, he talks that John Bedini talks about them in the Ferris wheel as well. I don't know what the heck he had in the Ferris wheel, but he mentions those. He mentions, Tom Bearden's got the those space astronaut boots. He's talking about Halbach arrays. Halbach. So that's going to be worth looking at, and that gets to the Howard Johnson stuff, not the hotel chain, the scientist who did so much with magnets. But this is plenty for now, and I'm curious as I don't want to curse. I'm curious as can be. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration. I'm very curious. Now I'm getting bored. What all this is going to do. So I have a lot of parts to order. I need to order some 18 gauge. I need to order some ferrite cores, and then there's going to be a lot of building involved. I need to order some more Hall effect sensors, and then getting it all hooked up with the Arduino. I've been taken to task because I like to say Arduino, like Arduino. But we'll get the thing built at some point here, but it's going to take a while. And right now, first thing I got to do is order the parts later today or tomorrow, and wait for them to get here. We'll do a little bit more with Q Effect just to wrap it up, kind of for the grand finale on the whole Q Effect series. I'm going to take a given length of wire and I'm going to wrap it as a single layer coil, and it's like a magician's trick. If I got it right, I think I can change the induction by like tenfold by wrapping the coil differently, and then seeing how the coils can wrap, how I can wrap different coils, what the induction is, and then also what the Q factor is as I change it. I'm not sure what I would do with it, yet, but I just want to confirm it. I'm kind of like going back and repeating a little bit of the work that Harold Wheeler did, that led to all the equations that people use for induction now, just to kind of repeat that and to see some of the cool stuff with that. So there'll be that, and then we get back to this, and then you might really ideally end up with a pretty cool machine or machines, depending on which of these bullet points and or if all of them are important. But this is really the one I'm most curious about. Let's see if that has an effect. Okay, thanks so much for coming along and listening to the babble and burble, and stay healthy. Back at you with more later. Bye-bye.